This one empath type brings avoidance to their knees. There is one type of empath that avoidance cannot casually dismiss, cannot easily manipulate, and almost always remember long after the relationship ends. Not the overly accommodating empath, not the endlessly patient empath, not the empath who sacrifices themselves hoping to be chosen. Those are familiar to the avoidant, predictable, safe. No, the empath who changes everything is the grounded empath, the one who feels deeply without drowning, the one who understands pain without volunteering to carry it, the one who can love fully while remaining entirely willing to walk away. And that, for an avoidant, is both magnetic and terrifying. You have to understand something fundamental about avoidant psychology. Avoidants are not running from love. They're running from dependency. They're running from the possibility that someone could gain enough emotional access to hurt them. Their nervous system has learned a simple equation. Closeness equals danger. Need equals vulnerability. Attachment equals loss of control. So when most people encounter an avoidant, they instinctively do exactly what triggers those defenses. They pursue harder. They demand reassurance. They protest distance. They negotiate for connection. Every one of those behaviors confirms the avoidant's deepest belief. Intimacy leads to pressure, but the grounded empath operates differently. They don't chase. They don't collapse. They don't interpret distance as a challenge to their worth. That alone is profoundly destabilizing, because avoidants are experts at managing reactions. They know how to handle pleading, anger, guilt, and emotional bargaining. They've rehearsed those scenarios their entire lives. What they are not prepared for is calm. Calm is difficult to manipulate. Calm cannot be baited. Calm forces honesty. The grounded empath possesses emotional containment. They can sit in uncertainty without trying to control it. They can witness another person's defenses without making those defenses their responsibility. This is incredibly rare. Most people confuse empathy with absorption. They think loving someone means entering their chaos. The grounded empath knows better. They understand that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. So when an avoidant pulls away, the grounded empath doesn't panic. They observe. When an avoidant tests boundaries, they don't retaliate. They clarify. When an avoidant withholds affection, they don't beg, they recalibrate. And suddenly, the avoidant encounters something unfamiliar. Consequences without hostility. That is psychologically transformative, because the grounded empath does not punish withdrawal. They simply refuse to participate in imbalance. This removes the avoidant's usual source of power. No pursuit, no emotional overfunctioning, no desperate attempts to restore connection. Just reality. And reality is where avoidants often feel least comfortable. You see, avoidants unconsciously rely on asymmetry. They feel safest when they control the emotional distance. They move closer when they choose. They retreat when they choose. But the grounded empath cannot be regulated externally. Their center of gravity is internal. That means the avoidant cannot control the pace of the relationship through distance alone. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant realizes they are dealing with someone who is fully available but entirely unowned. That creates profound attraction. Why? Because grounded empaths offer what avoidants secretly crave most: safe intimacy. No engulfment, no coercion, no emotional hostage-taking, just presence, steady, warm, and uncompromising. This kind of person becomes a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable. The grounded empath reflects the avoidant back to themselves not through criticism but through contrast. Their openness exposes the avoidant's guardedness. Their consistency exposes the avoidant's inconsistency. Their courage exposes the avoidant's fear. No accusation is necessary. Truth requires no volume. This is why avoidants often become unusually vulnerable around grounded empaths. They may disclose things they've never told anyone. They may pursue more intensely than usual. They may even appear transformed. But here's the critical point. The grounded empath is not trying to transform them. That lack of agenda is precisely what allows transformation to occur. People change fastest when they are not being managed. Avoidants sense this immediately. For once, they are not someone's project. They are simply being encountered. And being truly encountered is one of the rarest experiences a human being can have. Yet this dynamic contains an important warning. Many people mistake patience for power. Grounded empathy is not endless tolerance. It is selective investment. The grounded empath remains only where reciprocity exists. They understand a brutal truth. Potential is not intimacy. Intentions are not behavior. Chemistry is not compatibility. This is the line avoidants cannot cross casually. Because unlike others, the grounded empath will leave without theatrics. No dramatic ultimatums. No revenge. No emotional collapse. Just absence. And absence, when it follows genuine presence, is unforgettable. Why? Because the avoidant loses access to the one thing they could not dominate. Authentic connection. That loss often forces deep self-examination. Not always. Some avoidants retreat further. Some rationalize. Some repeat the cycle elsewhere. But the encounter stays with them. The grounded empath becomes the standard against which future relationships are unconsciously measured. They represent the road not taken, the intimacy that required courage, the love that demanded participation. And perhaps most importantly, they reveal that secure connection is possible. The avoidant's greatest fear is not abandonment. It's exposure. Exposure without rejection. Seen completely yet still free to choose. That is exactly what the grounded empath offers. And that offering is almost irresistible, because beneath every avoidant defense is an unspoken longing. Can I be close without disappearing? The grounded empath answers, yes, but only if both of us remain whole. That is not weakness. That is mastery. And mastery is what brings avoidants to their knees. Not through domination, not through pursuit, not through emotional warfare, but through unwavering self-possession. The avoidant finally encounters someone who can love them deeply without needing to control them. And more importantly, someone who can leave them without needing to destroy them. That combination is extraordinarily powerful. It dismantles old assumptions. It rewrites attachment expectations. It introduces a new possibility. Love without captivity. For the avoidant, that is revolutionary. For the empath, it is simply healthy. And health is always more attractive than dysfunction, especially to those who have spent their lives surrounded by it. Avoidants are not intimidated by neediness, they are accustomed to it. In many ways, they expect it. They have spent much of their lives developing an internal radar for emotional dependence. Sensing when someone is about to lean too heavily, demand too much, or unconsciously hand over responsibility for their emotional state. Neediness feels familiar to them, predictable, almost scripted. The moment they detect it, their defenses engage automatically. Distance increases, communication changes, intimacy begins to contract. Not because they are cruel, but because their nervous system has learned to interpret dependency as a threat. What truly unsettles an avoidant is something entirely different. Emotional self-sufficiency. A person who wants connection but does not require it for stability changes the entire dynamic. This kind of individual does not collapse when attention fluctuates. They do not spiral when texts go unanswered. They are not constantly seeking reassurance, nor are they outsourcing their sense of worth to another person's availability. They remain grounded, centered, and emotionally intact regardless of external circumstances. And for an avoidant, this is deeply disarming. Why? Because avoidants are highly skilled at managing reactions. They know how to navigate pursuit. They can predict the rhythm of someone who needs constant validation. Pull away, and the other person moves closer. Offer a little affection, and the bond tightens. This familiar dance gives the avoidant a sense of control. They can regulate proximity while maintaining emotional safety. But emotional self-sufficiency breaks that pattern. When an avoidant withdraws and the other person simply continues living their life, something unexpected happens. There is no frantic chase, no emotional bargaining, no attempt to force reconnection. The usual levers no longer work because there is nothing to leverage. The self-sufficient person is fully capable of enjoying connection, but equally capable of standing alone. That independence is magnetic. It communicates a level of internal security that avoidants both admire and fear. Admire because it represents strength. Fear because it removes their usual protective advantages. They can no longer rely on distance to maintain control. They can no longer assume the other person will always be waiting exactly where they left them. For perhaps the first time, they must confront a startling reality. This person can leave, not as punishment, not as manipulation, simply because they value reciprocity. This possibility awakens something profound inside the avoidant. Beneath their defenses lies a deep longing for intimacy without engulfment. They want closeness, but only when it feels safe. Emotional self-sufficiency provides that safety. It says, I can be with you without consuming you. I can love you without needing to own you. That is extraordinarily attractive. It also forces accountability. The avoidant can no longer hide behind the assumption that their partner will tolerate endless inconsistency. Stability demands participation. Presence becomes a choice rather than an obligation. And that is where real transformation begins. Avoidants are not changed by pressure. Pressure only confirms their fears. They are changed by encountering someone who embodies security so completely that avoidance itself becomes unnecessary. Someone who offers warmth without dependency, openness without desperation, and love without surrendering autonomy. Emotional self-sufficiency is not detachment. It is regulated attachment. It is the ability to remain connected without losing oneself. It is the rare quality that makes an avoidant reconsider everything they thought intimacy had to be. Neediness triggers defense. Self-sufficiency invites trust. And trust, when offered without demand, is one of the few things powerful enough to lower an avoidance walls. The rarest empath is not the one who feels the most. It is not the one who absorbs every emotion in the room, loses sleep over other people's struggles, or sacrifices their own well-being in the name of compassion. Those traits are often celebrated, but they can easily become liabilities. The rarest empath is something far more powerful. The grounded empath, a person who can feel deeply, understand profoundly, and care sincerely, while remaining completely anchored in their own center. This kind of empath does not confuse compassion with compliance. They understand that empathy is the ability to witness another person's internal world, not the obligation to fix it. They can sit with someone's pain without immediately trying to rescue them from it. They know the difference between supporting a person and carrying them. That distinction alone makes them extraordinarily uncommon. Most people, when faced with another person's suffering, instinctively move toward relief. They offer solutions, excuses, second chances, and endless emotional labor. Sometimes this comes from kindness. Sometimes it comes from discomfort. Pain in others can activate pain in ourselves, and many people rush to soothe others simply to quiet their own internal unease. The grounded empath operates differently. They are comfortable with discomfort. They can tolerate another person's sadness, anger, confusion, or even disapproval without losing emotional balance. This ability creates an almost magnetic presence. People feel safe around them because they are not reactive. They do not collapse under emotional intensity, nor do they become overwhelmed by the weight of another person's experience. This is precisely why they are so difficult to manipulate. Manipulation depends on emotional instability. It requires leverage, guilt, urgency, fear, obligation, or the promise of approval. Manipulators look for unguarded entry points, unresolved insecurities, excessive responsibility, or a compulsive need to be liked. They test boundaries the way a locksmith tests tumblers. The grounded empath has very few accessible locks. They know who they are. Their sense of self does not depend on external validation. They do not need to be perceived as endlessly kind, infinitely patient, or universally liked. They are willing to disappoint people when necessary. That willingness makes manipulation extraordinarily expensive and often entirely ineffective. They can hear a sob story without surrendering discernment. They can recognize genuine pain while still identifying harmful behavior. They understand that trauma may explain actions, but it does not excuse them. This balance is rare because it requires both an open heart and a disciplined mind. A grounded empath listens carefully, but they also observe patterns. They trust consistency over promises. They pay attention to actions, not just intentions. If words and behaviors do not align, they notice. And once they notice, they adjust accordingly. There is no dramatic confrontation required. They simply stop offering access where trust has not been earned. This can be deeply unsettling to manipulative individuals. They are accustomed to people who can be swayed by charm, guilt, or emotional volatility. The grounded empath remains calm. Their boundaries do not move simply because someone becomes upset. That calmness is often mistaken for coldness by those who benefit from chaos. It is not coldness, it is self-respect. The grounded empath understands a fundamental truth. Compassion without boundaries is not compassion. It is self-abandonment. True empathy does not require surrendering judgment, tolerating mistreatment, or accepting emotional exploitation. In fact, the healthiest empathy often looks like restraint. It means saying no when no is necessary. It means walking away when respect disappears. It means allowing others to face the consequences of their own choices. This is what makes the grounded empath so transformative in relationships. They offer warmth but never weakness. They provide understanding but never unlimited access. Their kindness is generous yet selective. They can love someone deeply without becoming controlled by that love. That is the highest form of empathy, not absorption, not martyrdom, not endless sacrifice, but presence with boundaries, compassion with clarity, and connection without surrender. The grounded empath is rare because they have done the difficult internal work. They have learned that protecting their peace is not selfish. It is necessary. And because of that, they become one of the few people capable of loving fully while remaining entirely free. Avoidants rarely enter intimacy the way most people imagine. They do not simply meet someone, feel safe, and gradually open up. Their process is far more complex, often invisible even to themselves. Before trust ever develops, they unconsciously conduct a series of tests. Not because they are calculating in a malicious way, but because their nervous system has been trained to prioritize safety over connection. To an avoidant, intimacy is not immediately comforting. It is potentially destabilizing. So they test. They test for control first. Control is their emotional oxygen. If closeness begins to feel like surrender, alarm bells ring. They want to know whether they can maintain autonomy while remaining connected. Will this person demand constant access? Will they respect boundaries? Will they attempt to dictate emotional timing? The avoidant watches carefully. They may delay responses, become inconsistent, or suddenly require space. These behaviors are often less about rejection and more about data collection. They are measuring whether the other person can tolerate uncertainty without escalating. If the response is panic, pressure, or emotional pursuit, the avoidant's concerns are confirmed. Dependency feels imminent. Their defenses strengthen. Then comes the test of distance. Avoidants are experts at creating emotional space. Sometimes physical distance, sometimes psychological, often both. They may become less expressive, less available, or momentarily detached. This isn't always conscious manipulation. More often, it is a reflexive attempt to regulate their own internal discomfort. Distance serves a dual purpose. It allows them to restore equilibrium, and it reveals how the other person handles absence. Do they maintain their own life? Do they become accusatory? Do they spiral into insecurity? Avoidants pay close attention to these reactions because they interpret them as indicators of future safety. Someone who can remain emotionally steady during moments of separation becomes deeply intriguing. It suggests maturity, security, low threat. But someone who collapses under temporary distance activates the avoidant's deepest fears. They begin to associate intimacy with responsibility for another person's emotional regulation. That is precisely what they are trying to avoid. The final test is emotional leverage. This is perhaps the most subtle and least understood. Avoidants want to know whether their vulnerabilities will later be used against them. Can they reveal fear, weakness, or uncertainty without creating a power imbalance? They have often learned through experience that emotional exposure can become ammunition. A confession today can become a weapon tomorrow, so they proceed cautiously. They may disclose something personal, then observe what happens next. Does the other person honor that trust, or do they later use it to guilt, pressure, or gain advantage? If vulnerability becomes transactional, the avoidant retreats immediately. Trust evaporates. Walls rise higher than before. This is why avoidance can seem contradictory. They may crave closeness intensely, then recoil the moment it appears available. What they seek is not intimacy alone, but safe intimacy connection without coercion, closeness without captivity. And safety for them must be proven repeatedly. People often misunderstand these tests as games. Sometimes they can certainly feel that way, especially when communication is poor. But beneath the behavior lies a nervous system asking urgent questions. Can I still be myself here? Can I leave without punishment? Can I reveal myself without losing power? Can I need you without becoming trapped? Only when the answers consistently feel safe does genuine trust begin to form. This is why secure individuals often have the greatest impact on avoidance. They do not overreact to distance. They do not weaponize vulnerability. They do not attempt to control outcomes through emotional intensity. Instead, they remain steady. That steadiness short-circuits the avoidant's defensive expectations. Eventually, the avoidant realizes something extraordinary. They no longer need to test so aggressively because the environment itself feels safe. Control becomes less necessary. Distance becomes less appealing. Emotional leverage disappears as a concern. That is when real intimacy begins. Not when attraction appears, not when chemistry ignites, but when the avoidant no longer feels the need to protect themselves from the very person they are growing to love. The grounded empath occupies a space that most people never fully learn to inhabit. They do not lunge toward connection out of fear, nor do they retreat from it out of pride. They stay. They remain emotionally present, internally stable, and deeply aware of both themselves and the person in front of them. This is not passivity. It is mastery. Most relationship dynamics are built around movement. One person advances, the other retreats. One pursues, the other distances. This push and pull can become so familiar that many mistake it for chemistry. In reality, it is often just unregulated attachment acting out old patterns. The grounded empath refuses to participate in that dance. When someone pulls away, they do not interpret it as a call to chase. They understand that another person's distance is information, not an emergency. They do not scramble to restore equilibrium through over-texting, over-explaining, or over-giving. Their self-worth does not hinge on immediate reassurance. They can tolerate ambiguity without collapsing into anxiety. At the same time, they do not weaponize detachment. They do not disappear to prove a point, manufacture scarcity, or regain control. They have no interest in emotional games because games are substitutes for genuine communication. Withdrawal, when used as punishment, is simply manipulation wearing sophistication. The grounded empath chooses neither extreme. They remain centered. That centeredness comes from an internal anchor. Their emotional stability is generated from within, not borrowed from another person's consistency. They enjoy connection, but they do not rely on it for identity. They value intimacy, but they do not confuse intimacy with survival. This creates an entirely different relational atmosphere. When the other person moves closer, the grounded empath welcomes it without becoming consumed. They do not abandon their routines, values, or boundaries in the excitement of new attachment. They remain themselves. When the other person moves away, they notice without panicking. They may inquire, clarify, or observe, but they do not contort themselves trying to reverse the movement. They respect the information being presented. That is power, because people can only manipulate your reactions when your center lives outside of you. The grounded empath center is non-transferable. They do not need to win every interaction. They do not need to control every outcome. They do not even need every relationship to continue. Their peace is not dependent on another person's choices. This is profoundly attractive, especially to emotionally avoidant individuals. Avoidants are accustomed to triggering predictable reactions. Distance usually creates pursuit. Ambiguity usually creates anxiety. Silence usually creates pressure. But the grounded empath responds differently. They remain calm. That calmness can feel almost disorienting. There is no emotional chaos to manage, no desperation to soothe, no leverage to exploit. The avoidant suddenly encounters a person who can care deeply without losing composure. This often creates respect where chaos would have created withdrawal. Remaining centered also means holding boundaries without hostility. The grounded empath can say, "I understand your need for space, and I also know what I need." They do not issue ultimatums. They simply honor their own standards. If reciprocity disappears, they do not beg for it. If respect fades, they do not negotiate for it. If connection becomes one-sided, they do not compensate indefinitely. They adjust. This ability separates healthy empathy from self-abandonment. Many people think love means enduring anything. The grounded empath knows better. Love without self-respect is dependency disguised as devotion. To remain centered is to trust yourself more than the temporary fluctuations of another person's behavior. It is to understand that someone's inconsistency does not require your instability. And perhaps most importantly, it is to recognize that connection should expand your life, not consume it. The grounded empath neither chases nor withdraws because both are attempts to regulate discomfort externally. Chasing seeks relief through proximity. Withdrawing seeks relief through distance. Centeredness seeks no such relief. It allows discomfort to exist without surrendering control. That is emotional maturity in its purest form. It is what makes the grounded empath so difficult to manipulate, so safe to love, and so unforgettable to those who encounter them. Stability has a peculiar effect on avoidance. At first it feels refreshing, then it feels unfamiliar, and eventually it becomes deeply unsettling. Not because stability is dangerous, but because it removes every excuse, every distraction, and every defensive maneuver they have relied upon for years. When chaos is absent, there is nowhere left to hide. Avoidants are highly adapted to instability. They know how to navigate inconsistency, emotional turbulence, and ambiguous relationships. In those environments, their distancing strategies feel useful, even necessary. They can justify withdrawal. They can maintain emotional control. They can remain partially engaged while keeping the most vulnerable parts of themselves carefully protected. But stability changes the entire equation. A stable person does not overreact. They do not chase when distance appears. They do not collapse under silence, nor do they retaliate when boundaries are set. Their emotions remain regulated. Their communication remains clear. Their self-worth remains intact regardless of the avoidance fluctuations. For the avoidant, this is both calming and terrifying. Calming because it creates the safety they have always claimed to want. Terrifying because safety eliminates their defenses. Distance no longer serves as effective protection when the other person refuses to panic. Withdrawal no longer creates the emotional leverage it once did. Silence no longer guarantees control. The familiar tools lose their power, and with them the illusion of invulnerability. What remains is exposure. This is the moment avoidants often experience a profound internal conflict. Part of them longs to move closer. Another part urgently wants to retreat. Their nervous system, trained by past experiences, interprets genuine intimacy as risk even when their rational mind recognizes the relationship as healthy. That conflict can be intense, because true vulnerability is not merely revealing personal information. Avoidants can sometimes share stories, childhood wounds, or intellectual insights while remaining emotionally defended. Real vulnerability goes much deeper. It is allowing another person to matter. It is permitting their presence to influence your emotional state. It is investing in something you cannot fully control. And control has always been the avoidant's preferred substitute for safety. A stable partner quietly dismantles that substitute. They demonstrate over time that closeness does not have to mean engulfment. Boundaries can coexist with intimacy. Independence can survive connection, but these lessons cannot be learned intellectually. They must be experienced emotionally. That is what makes them so challenging. The avoidant must eventually decide whether to trust the evidence in front of them or the protective beliefs behind them. Can closeness really be safe? Can I rely on someone without losing myself? Can I be known without being controlled? These are not casual questions. They strike at the core of the avoidance identity. For years, self-protection may have been mistaken for strength. Emotional distance may have felt synonymous with independence. But stability reveals an uncomfortable truth. Walls are not freedom. They are confinement disguised as control. And once an avoidant experiences genuine emotional safety, returning to superficial connection becomes increasingly difficult. The stable person becomes a mirror. In their consistency, the avoidant sees their own inconsistency. In their openness, they see their guardedness. In their courage, they see the cost of their own fear. This can provoke resistance. Sometimes they pull away. Sometimes they test boundaries. Sometimes they momentarily sabotage the very connection they crave. Not because they do not care, because they care enough for it to matter. And mattering is the birthplace of vulnerability. Ultimately, stability offers avoidance something both precious and frightening. The opportunity to stop performing self-protection and start practicing trust. That transition is not easy. It requires surrendering familiar defenses, tolerating uncertainty, and risking disappointment. It demands emotional courage. But it also offers something extraordinary, the possibility of intimacy without imprisonment, love without annihilation, connection without losing autonomy. This is why stability can feel so transformative. It does not force avoidants to become different people. It simply makes their old defenses unnecessary. And when defenses are no longer needed, vulnerability is no longer weakness. It becomes freedom. Healthy empathy is often misunderstood. Many people confuse it with rescuing, fixing, or endlessly accommodating another person's struggles. They believe that if they truly care, they must absorb the pain, solve the problem, and protect the other person from every consequence. It sounds noble. It often feels loving. But more often than not, it creates dependency rather than connection. Rescuing is not empathy. Rescuing is control disguised as compassion. When you rescue someone, you subtly communicate that they are incapable of handling their own life. You step into responsibilities that do not belong to you. You carry emotional burdens that were never yours to begin with. And while this can create temporary closeness, it almost always erodes respect over time. Healthy empathy operates very differently. It reflects. To reflect someone is to truly see them, to hear not only their words, but the emotions underneath them. It means offering understanding without immediately rushing to intervene. Sometimes the most healing thing a person can experience is not advice, but accurate recognition. A simple, sincere acknowledgement can be profoundly regulating. I can see why that hurt. That sounds incredibly frustrating. No wonder you're exhausted. Reflection tells a person your internal experience makes sense. That validation can be far more powerful than any solution. Healthy empathy also contains. Containment is one of the least discussed yet most important interpersonal skills. It means remaining emotionally steady in the presence of another person's distress. You do not become overwhelmed simply because they are overwhelmed. You do not absorb their panic, mirror their chaos, or lose your own center. Instead, you offer regulated presence. You become a safe container in which difficult emotions can exist without taking over the entire relationship. This is especially important when dealing with highly emotional, anxious, or avoidant individuals. They often do not need someone to fix them. They need someone who can tolerate their discomfort without escalating it. Containment communicates safety. It says, "Your feelings are welcome here, but they do not control me." That boundary is deeply stabilizing. And then comes the part many people resist: reciprocity. Healthy empathy is not a one-way transaction. It does not require one person to give endlessly while the other only receives. Compassion without reciprocity quickly becomes emotional labor, and emotional labor without mutuality becomes exploitation. A healthy relationship requires movement in both directions. Both people must be willing to listen. Both must be capable of accountability. Both must contribute to repair. Without reciprocity, empathy becomes depletion. This is where many empaths lose themselves. They mistake another person's pain for permission. They tolerate imbalance because they understand the reasons behind it. They excuse repeated harm because they can see the wounds that caused it. But understanding someone is not the same as volunteering for mistreatment. Trauma may explain behavior, but it does not excuse the absence of responsibility. Healthy empathy recognizes this distinction. It allows compassion and standards to coexist. You can deeply understand why someone behaves the way they do while also refusing to accept harmful patterns. That is not coldness. That is wisdom. In fact, requiring reciprocity is one of the highest forms of respect. It communicates that you view the other person as capable, accountable, and fully responsible for their choices. You are not their parent. You are not their therapist. You are not their emotional life support system. You are their equal. And equality is the foundation of genuine intimacy. Healthy empathy does not say, "I will save you." It says, "I will see you, support you, and walk beside you, but you must also walk." That distinction changes everything. It protects your peace while preserving their dignity. It creates connection without codependency. It allows love to flourish without turning into obligation. The strongest empath is not the one who gives the most. It is the one who can remain open-hearted while maintaining clear boundaries. The one who offers understanding without surrendering self-respect. Because true empathy does not remove another person's responsibility. It invites them to rise and meet you there.